Hi, I'm Cathal Boland, a member of Fingal IRA, Commemorative Society, 1916 to 1921. And I want to tell you a story about Mortown Camp outside Oldtown, which operated late 1920 and the first 6 months of 1921. And the men who were billeted there, their exploits, and some of the raids in which they were involved. Following the sack of Ballyboughal, which took place at the end of September 1920 and resulted in 2 RIC officers being shot dead and 2 RIA men taken out and murdered, and the town burnt, homes destroyed. This was followed in October by the killing of Cathaoirleach, the captain of the Skerries Company, then by the murder in Rush of Jack Rover McCann. That happened on the night of Bloody Sunday, and by the killing of the Sinn Féin judge Thomas Hand at the start of December at Ballyboughal, just north of Skerries. Men were now reluctant to stay in their homes at night, as the towns operated a general policy of raiding homes for known activists. Men were naturally afraid for their lives and what might happen to their families. One of these, Tom Peppard, went to stay with friends at Mooretown, near Oldtown, on a farm owned by the Sheridans of Oldcastle in County Meath. As an aside, those Sheridans, for those of us who are old enough to remember black and white television, will well remember Monica licking her fingers, and they're the same Sheridans. The farm was managed by relations of the Sheridans, the Smiths, a brother and sister, and they made Peppard welcome. Soon other men, who also were on the run, were staying there. The increase in numbers were such that they moved from the house to the barn so that they could accommodate all. There had been some talk of a truce around the Christmas period, and Bishop Clune of Australia was involved. His nephew had been killed also on Bloody Sunday, but he'd been murdered in Dublin Castle. But those talks required the surrender of arms, so they didn't go anywhere. Those who fought for Ireland were not prepared to surrender so easily. In the spring of 1921, General Headquarters began to organise different brigades into divisions, and the Fingal Brigade was incorporated into the 1st Eastern Division, which had its headquarters at Dunboyne, County Meath. A fellow called Shot Boland was the divisional OC of Meath. His son would later give Dublin some grief on the GAA pitches. Tom Peppard was now appointed intelligence officer to the brigade. He would, after independence, say that they were left to plot their own way. No one then seemed to appreciate the values of efficient intelligence service, and it was only when the whole thing was well over and finished with that the value of intelligence began to dawn. They then realised what could have been done in this respect had they been trained and directed in the right way. I wonder what Michael Collins would have said had he heard him saying that. Out of the Mooretown group, an active service unit was formed. They had about 10 or 12 men initially, and this was augmented by volunteers from the adjacent companies as required. All the men were armed with .303s, and they'd been issued with 150 rounds of service ammunition. The rifles were some of those which had been captured in the Collinstown raid in March 1919. That operation had been carried out by the Dublin Brigade, but the Fingal Brigade were given the undertaking of moving the weapons to safety on the night. Michael Rock had been the one to organise that, and he says that there was 110 rifles given to him from Collinstown, and that he had passed on 96 to the Dublin Brigade later on. that he managed to make an agreement with Collins that his pay for the work that the brigade in Fingal had done was those 14 rifles. But other accounts would suggest that only 70 rifles found their way back to Dublin, and that figure seems to be more accurate as rifles from Collinstown keep popping up. Rock makes reference to supplying his own company, which was separate to Moortown, and this may account for that discrepancy. Michael Rock and two volunteers, both from Balbriggan, James Gaynor and William Cochrane, were sought after the sack of Balbriggan, which involved the shooting of the two RIC officers, the Burke brothers, and whose killing led to the sack of Balbriggan. Both Gaynor and Cochrane had seen service with Cathal Boland, the then Chief of Staff of the IRA in 1918, when he took a party to London to shoot the British Cabinet if the conscription bill was signed into law. It didn't become law, and they all came home. Anyhow, after the sack, Gaynor and Cochrane had gone on the run. Rock had plenty of places to hide around Knoll where he could feel safe, and he continued to have operations undertaken in Balbriggan area until he was shot in the leg shortly before the truce in July 1921. Gaynor and Cochrane moved around the North County before joining the Mortown Camp and the active service unit there. Soon the numbers of the camp were too big to be accommodated in the barn which was provided by the Sheridans, and the men transferred to the camp at the Green Lane, a short distance away, the entrance to which was directly opposite the Wren's Nest and ran from there across to Palmerstown Cemetery. Recently, the Fingal IRA Commemorative Society, whose focus, as I say, is 1916 to 1921 period, had a marker stone placed to identify this important entrance spot to a camp which was very important during the War of Independence. The men in the camp still continue to do their cooking at Sheridan's under the direction of Miss Smith. Food was procured from Oldtown and shops and swords, most notably tailors. These were paid for out of brigade funds. Men from different battalions were taken into the camp for short periods, and while there all underwent training, and some saw service with the ASU. The camp became a refuge not only for Fingal men, but also provided sanctuary for men on the run from other parts of the country. There is evidence that it also provided some element of hospital service during this period. As the camp grew, it acquired bell tents and it became sophisticated. It was well run, and the men provided their own guards and security patrols, whilst also availing of the assistance of local volunteers drawn from the Oldtown Company, notably men such as the Menton brothers and Ned Orange. Ned, who lived in the village, had been in America with De Valera. The column was in that area for some months and operated from there right up, as I say, to the truce of July 21. Its existence was within a few miles of Swords, where there was a strong military garrison and TANs were stationed. But they never seemed to know that the location was there. The column mixed freely with the people of the area and attended Mass in Oldtown. Some had a pint in the local pub, while others were regular visitors in their neighbours' homes. The locals never indulged in loose talk, which would have given away the position. On one occasion, the Protestant minister in Oldtown sent for Peppert and informed him that he had had dinner with a number of British officers and senior police who were present. And he'd gathered from their conversation that these gentlemen suspected that the camp may have been in the Oldtown area. The Reverend wanted Pepper to know that the members of his church would not be suspected of having informed on the camp. This clergyman, who had served during the Great War in the British uniform as a chaplain, had at a service in his church one Sunday, advised his congregation this was a fight between England and Ireland, and that if their sympathy was that with Britain, with England, then it was their duty to get into British uniform and fight on that side. But if they weren't prepared to do that, then they should keep their mouths shut. One of the first operations carried out by the men of the column was to raid the British Army Remount depot at Lusk. The staff of this depot were all civilians, and the manager was a retired British officer, a Major Beamish. Here, horses were broken and trained for remounts for the British cavalry regiments. It was a very important location during the war. Of course, by 1921, its importance had waned, and the motor was year on year replacing the horse. Still, there was a demand for good Irish horses, and Remount continued to supply these. The payroll for the farm and the staff came from Dublin in an armoured car. The delivery was regular, and sometimes the money bags were just dropped into the office, while on other occasions those who delivered waited until the payment was made and then returned to the city. A party comprising Jack Shields of Ballyboughal, Brock Maguire, Jim Crinigan from Roganstown, along with another man called Mason, accompanied by Peppard, waited outside the depot at the expected time of the delivery. When they observed the armoured car leaving after the delivery was made, before the payroll could have been divided up, they proceeded into the office and held up the manager, Major Beamish, with their revolvers. And they took the keys to the safe from the Major, opened it, removing the money. Maguire had pulled the phone out of action, and some reports say they got about £300. Others suggest that it was 600. Whatever the amount, it was handed over to the brigade, and they all got away safely without incident. Remount was the subject of a second attack, and it was decided to return and burn the depot to the ground. The then Brigade OC, Michael Lynch, took command of that operation, and most of the column were engaged in this operation. All carried rifles or revolvers. The British did not keep a guard on the place, strangely enough, so it was an easy affair. The Major and grooms who were present were all made prisoners and held under guard in the riding ring. The remainder of the men let the horses out of the stables into the adjoining paddocks. And then they saturated the place with paraffin oil, which had been dumped locally by the local volunteers. There was also some oil available on the premises. When the premises were set alight, it was found that a few of the horses were still in their stables. As they could not be released, they had to be shot to prevent them being burnt to death. The whole affair was carried out very quickly and without incident, unless you consider having to shoot horses an incident. They started the trek back to Mooretown, which was lighted for a while by what they described as a beautiful blaze from the Remount farm. Orders were now received from GHQ to capture the outgoing mails from the Tans camp in Gormanstown. Collins, as Director of Intelligence, required the home addresses of members of the Black and Tans so that their homes in England could be burnt as a counter-reprisal for the homes they burnt here. The manner of procuring the mails came up at the Brigade Council, and it was decided that the best time to take the mail was between their arrival at the post office when it was sorted and the time that it arrived at the rail station. Because whilst the mail arrived under heavy guard, it was sorted without guard and was moved then on a handcart to the rail station by a man on his own. So the active service unit acquired a car and waited in the car park at the rail station and relieved the post hand of the bag of mail. The Tans observed what was going on and gave chase to the car. The car sped out towards the knoll. When it got near enough to knoll, there was a fella standing on the road, Michael Rock. They pushed the bag of mail out. He grabbed it and buried himself and the bag in the ditch. And the tender carrying the Tans passed him by, eager to catch up with the car. The car sped across back roads, through village streets, and trundled its way down the back of Garristown into Ballymount, where they lost the Tans. The men then recovered the bag of mail from Rock, and they went through it to gather the necessary information. The whole lot was burnt, but of course there were some money notes and a number of small postal orders, the majority of which were negotiable, and these were cashed in at small rural post offices, whilst larger postal orders would have been traceable and would have raised suspicion of anybody going in to try and cash them. After that attack or raid, the men noted that the mail was now treated differently, and it was brought from Gormanstown by car to Dublin directly. And they made a number of attempts to intercept that car without success. So, another event that happened was they decided to have a crack at the officer in charge at Mortown Camp as he travelled back from Dublin. He and some of his fellow officers were in the habit of going into Dublin to some of the fine restaurants, probably places like Jammy's and so on. The squad decided to ambush the car at the Five Roads at Hedgestown. That's just north of Ballyboughal. And they got themselves a steel wire and they put a stake in the ground. They put shooters with shotguns into the ditches and men with rifles on the high ground on the east side of the road. So they were waiting for the expected moment of the car to arrive. And he was a fairly regular sort of character. So they were fairly confident that they'd be at the rope up in time. But the car was slightly early and the rope was only going across the road. But one of the shotgun guys opened fire. The lights went off in the car and it sped on. Rifle fire was sent after it. But the lights came back on as the car continued to speed away. They subsequently learnt that they had been successful. They'd hit the car. The only problem was they hadn't hit anyone. The Tans were in the habit of frequenting a public house in Mullen to procure a drink, and it was decided to shoot them up when the Tans were on the premises, settling in for a drink. And when the Tans were on the premises, the squad moved in. But one man was carrying an automatic revolver. He managed to pull the trigger. Fortunately, it was facing towards the ground. And all the shells, or all the bullets, went straight through into the floor. And the Tans made a quick escape. But the Tans didn't go back drinking in that pub again. The brigade also planned to attack the British Tans coming back off local leave at night, back to Gormanstown, the induction camp where they were trained. And large numbers of them went by train from there to Ballyboughal and some on into Dublin from the rail station at Gormanstown. The station is a short distance from the camp and is connected to the main Dublin-Belfast road by a short byroad. This byroad would be crowded with Tans coming off the train, and it was here that it was decided to shoot them up. A Lewis gun was procured from GHQ, and this was mounted or rested on the windscreen of a car. When the night selected for the ambush arrived, they were waiting for the moment for the train to arrive, but they had scouts out, and the scouts reported back to them that there was either an armoured car or some other vehicle stationed at the road junction, and their party decided to retreat, with nothing accomplished. It turned out that it was a local taxi guy from Balbriggan up trying to pick up easy fares to run the lads down to Gormanstown. On another occasion, there were a few local men who were out in the fields on the run, and they spotted lights of a car or a lorry approaching the village. It was a tender, and it reached the village, and they could see that it halted. The scouts went carefully forward into the village to find out what was happening. They found the Tans had raided a public house there and had gone towards Balbriggan. They decided to go and try and head them off, and they headed through the fields, and the lads, about 9 or 10 of them, all armed with shotguns, got to the Ballyboughal crossroads and were in the act of rounding up horses to turn out onto the road when the Tans arrived. So they hurriedly occupied positions and opened fire on them as they passed. The tender didn't halt, just fired back at random as it sped on. The IRA guys had actually shot dead one of the RIC men, a man called Lynch, who was acting as a guide for the Tans that night. And it seems this man had formerly been stationed in Lusk and knew the country and the people around. He apparently lived in Donabate, and it's still said there that he was a spy rather than an RIC constable, and that he was informing on the locals. And strangely enough, it's funny when you're reading this stuff how you meet people who collaborate the stories, and that last piece of the story was given to me by the president of our society when I mentioned the fact that a man had been killed at Ballyboughal. The brigade arranged to defend Lusk against reprisals by the Tans for about the next 4 nights, but nothing happened, so they pulled away. Also in April of 21, a party of ASU men went out early in the morning to hold up an RIC patrol. The patrol never showed. And the lads hung around the village of Ballyboughal for the day. And the day would end with an RIC sergeant and the captain of the Swords Company both mortally wounded in the village. That story is shown in Who Shot Sergeant Kirwan. It was the intention of the General Headquarters to land a consignment of Tommy submachine guns from the United States at Lough Shinny. Lough Shinny is just south of Skerries. It's a small fishing harbour, but at that time it had a respectable fishing fleet working out of that harbour. And perhaps it was the intention to move the arms from a freighter to ferry them into Lough Shinny harbour, because berthing would not have been realistic or possible of any sort of a sizable boat. But it was imperative that all the Coast Guard stations would be destroyed. And orders came down to the different brigades that they would have to destroy the stations within their area. And the ones that were particularly assigned to the Moortown Camp, or the north end of the county, were obviously Balbriggan, Skerries, Lough Shinny. Lough Shinny had a company from Moortown went into it, and they turned it over, and they were successful. It was decided that Balbriggan was located in too dangerous an area to attempt to burn, and it wasn't burnt in the burning of the Coast Guard stations, and wasn't burnt until 1923, and it was burnt as part of the Civil War. The Skerries one was out on Red Island Head, and it was deemed also to be too difficult. But Michael Rock decided that it wasn't too difficult for Rock and his men. 12 o'clock at midnight was the appointed hour for the raid to go ahead. Rock got his men and some of the local volunteers, and he positioned his men with rifles, again part of the Collins Town Hall, to be able to take protective action against the RIC and whatever towns were in the village. And he brought some trusted men and some volunteers. The volunteers all carried buckets of paraffin. And they succeeded in burning the Coast Guard station and getting back away. Rock was quite a daredevil, a man who was prepared to take chances. And for him, most of them paid off. The guns never arrived, the Tommy guns. Now, there are different stories from right around the coast. And whilst part of the plan in terms of burning the Coast Guard stations adjacent to Lough was that it would cause confusion as to where or what was going on, Collins would appear to have given instructions around the coast to do that across the country. But it was all fruitless. The Tommy gun had been in production for the World War, and they missed the day. And the IRA went in and bought something in the region of 1,000 weapons and put cash on the table, just as Harry Boland had financed the Russians in America by putting cash on the table in lieu of the Russian crown jewels. But that's another story. The Tommy guns were developed, they were made, they were delivered to the Keys. But there was an American trade union strike on the docks. And they had to get clearance from the trade union to allow the Irish consignment break the picket. They got permission to break the picket. They loaded the boat, and just at the final point, a Greek decided there was something strange with the consignment, and he alerted the authorities, and the ship was impounded. So all the Coast Guard stations haven't been burnt. Wherever the intended moment wasn't to happen. But Tommy guns played a part. About a half a dozen of them had come in as samples, and two Americans, former officers, came across to demonstrate them. And Tommy guns were first fired in the casino basement in Marino. They're apparently a long passageway, and they were well able to demonstrate its capacity. It was then next recorded as having been used on the main street of Drumcondra. But back to Mooretown and the men who operated from there. One of the ASU men was heading back on a cycle towards Mooretown through, it would appear to me, to be Roganstown. He was in possession of a 45 and ammunition, along with £20 in single notes. All belonged to the brigade funds, of course. He just rounded a bend on the road when he heard a lorry of tans, and as the lorry passed him, they shouted at him to halt. And he dismounted from his bicycle. As the lorry came to a standstill, he made a dash through a gateway into a field. They fired at him and gave chase, and realising he'd never get away from them, and feeling almost exhausted, he took a gamble and he dived into the Broadmeadow River and sunk into the mud between the vegetation and the mud and the Broadmeadow River. He disappeared for all intents and purposes. And they searched the area for him thoroughly for several times, passing quite close to where he lay. He could see their boots on the banks, and he lay face down in the mud. When he got a chance, he concealed the money and ammunition in a rat hole in the bank. Eventually, they tired of searching for him, and they got in their lorry and went off. He got up and headed back to Oldtown to the column. Later on, Jim Croonigan and himself returned and looked for the money, and after a lot of searching, they found it and the ammunition where he had it concealed. Some people had good luck, others were not so lucky. The unit received word that the CEO of Mortown Camp and other such people would be dining with the Smiths, the business people, in their home in Ballyboughal. The ASU organised themselves to visit during dinner. So the attacking party was divided up into smaller groups. They were each to approach the town by different routes, not to call attention to themselves. One group was coming in on the Skerries Road. Along their way, they met a single soldier who challenged them. And the two of them proceeded to shoot him, killed him. And this caused the entire attack to be cancelled. That guy had bad luck, obviously. The ASU weren't too happy. And the OC had an enjoyable dinner, unaware of his fortunate escape. So, when we got to June, there was talk again of the truce. And suddenly, all things had changed. Lloyd George took up the King's suggestion, which he had made at the opening of the Northern Parliament, that men should approach it with goodwill. And Lloyd George invited Craig, the new Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, and Mr. De Valera, the representative of the Irish people in Southern Ireland, and told De Valera there'd be no preconditions and that he could bring whoever he liked with him to London and they'd all have free passage. They'd be safely returned to Ireland. De Valera played a card, and he included in whom he intended to take the four Unionist MPs who were elected for the 26 counties, within the 26 counties. And one of them was Lord Middleton, and obviously a sensible man. And he put out an overture to Lloyd George to agree to a truce, which Lloyd George did, providing that the OC, the armed forces operating in Ireland, agreed. Lord Middleton again used his good offices and got McCreevy to visit De Valera and his team in the Mansion House. So on the 8th of July, the truce was agreed to come into effect on the 11th of July. The men of Mooretown all headed off to go back home to the bosom of their families. Tom Peppard had another idea. He proposed to Miss Smith, and she accepted. They married, had family, and many of those people are still living amongst us here in North Fingal, particularly in the Rush area. Now, thank you very much.